friends, welcome back to another Before You Read lecture. This is another lecture in the series exploring the apocalyptic literature. And once again, this lecture takes us into a rather unfamiliar text to many Christians. It is a text that is known as 4th Ezra. It's another one of the texts that has been grouped together in what is known as the pseudepigrapha, or sometimes the apocrypha. This general collection of literature that was written sometime after the last writing in the Hebrew Bible was written, and sometime around the writing of the New Testament. Sometimes these writings are written at the same time as some of our New Testament writings, and some are written just after. But the pseudepigrapha, the apocrypha, provide important resources for understanding what takes place in the New Testament, especially the book of Revelation, which we'll get to eventually in our study of the apocalyptic literature. To begin with, I want to ask the question, is it that Ezra, right? Is the Ezra that is mentioned in 4th Ezra that Ezra? And by that Ezra, I'm referring to the Ezra that we meet in the Hebrew Bible in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. These are books near the end of the Hebrew Bible, especially if you're reading from the Jewish Bible. They would come in the section of the writings. And Ezra and Nehemiah both concern the rebuilding projects that the people of Judah make in and around Jerusalem following the Babylonian exile. So remember, in 586, the destruction of the temple, and Babylon takes sort of the great people, the leaders, and the good-looking people from Jerusalem and dispels them elsewhere in the Babylonian Empire. And then then Cyrus of Persia is victorious, conquers the land of Babylon, takes over sort of that area of the world. And Cyrus says to the Jews living in exile, you can go back, you can rebuild, you can even build your city walls, you can rebuild your temple. And this is the start of what is known as the Second Temple period. And in the Hebrew Bible, we meet Ezra and Nehemiah, who were both really significant figures in this rebuilding program. They instituted a number of cultural and religious reforms. You might remember famously they advocated for the divorcing of any foreign spouses, any non-Jew or non-Israelite spouses. They were in order to sort of purify the people. And Ezra and Nehemiah represents this theology that we've seen elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible, that the fall of the temple happened because Israel was unfaithful to the God of Israel, especially in the worship and veneration of other deities. And so the idea of divorcing these wives is to say, hey, we need to avoid that temptation. We need to be ultimately faithful to our God of Israel. Now, scholars debate whether or not this actually ever happened, the divorces, the forced divorces of these foreign spouses, but it represents this desire to sort of realign all of life to obey the law and obey the ways of God. When we meet Ezra, this character named Ezra, in the 3rd chapter of 4th Ezra, there are questions about whether or not that Ezra is this person named Ezra. And I will tell you that it's probably very unlikely that this historical persona known as 4th Ezra that we learn about through the Hebrew Bible is the author of this apocalypse known as 4th Ezra. I'll say more about it now, or in just a few moments, but for now, it's most likely that this is an author writing in the name of Ezra. And it's this concept, again, that we've talked about in the past of prophecy ex eventu. It's written in a period hundreds of years before the events that it's describing. So Ezra was active in the 5th century BCE and seems to be describing actions that are happening in the 1st century CE, so some 600 years in the future. But what is more likely the case is that a Jewish author is drawing on the legacy or the memory of Ezra and writing this purported prophecy in order to help people living in that first century interpret and understand what is going on around them. So now that I've somewhat qualified who this Ezra character is, the second question is, what is 4th Ezra? Just like we asked with 1st Enoch, we asked, what is 1st Enoch? I want to ask, what is 4th Ezra? And now I have to say that this is one of the more confusing parts of this textual tradition. There is a very confusing tradition of different names being associated with the book that we'll focus on, the book that I will call 4th Ezra throughout. But you just have to know that if you look in other Bibles or other collections of these ancient texts, it may have a different name. So let me explain a little bit about how this came to be. You probably are familiar with the Latin Vulgate, the Latin translation of both the Old Testament and the New Testament and some of the apocryphal documents into Latin. So you can see that in the Roman Empire, there was a desire not to have somebody who could know Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek, right? But instead could just read it in one language in Latin. And that became known as the Vulgate. And so all of these texts that were would eventually be canonized, or some that would become apocryphal in the Protestant tradition, were translated into Latin around the end of the 4th century CE. And so we get the names for 4th Ezra from this tradition. And so in the Latin Vulgate tradition, there are two books known as 1st and 2nd Esdras. And these are equivalent to our Ezra and Nehemiah. I know, it's really confusing. And then we have 3rd Esdras, which is essentially, it's a paraphrase of parts of 2nd Chronicles, all of Ezra, and parts of Nehemiah. So it's a newer book, or it's a composite book. And then finally, we have 4th Esdras, which is the Apocalypse that's written in Latin. That's going to be our focus. But if you were to open up the King James Version of the Bible, or even the Revised Standard Version with the Apocrypha material in the middle, you would find that we have Ezra and Nehemiah, familiar books. Then we have something called 1st Esdras, which is, again, the composite, the paraphrase of 2nd Chronicles and Ezra and parts of Nehemiah. And then you would have 2nd Esdras, which is equivalent to 4th Esdras in the Vulgate. So if your head is not spinning, congratulations, you clearly drank your coffee this morning. If your head is spinning, join the party. What matters is that we'll be calling this 4th Ezra, and that by this weird naming principle, what we're seeing is that the ancient readers, the ancient transmitters of this text associated it with Ezra and Nehemiah and this other composite work that was summarizing the same period of time. As I said, 4th Ezra is very likely an example of pseudepigrapha, writing in the name of another. We see the identification of the author as Ezra in 3:1, and he talks about writing in the 13th year after the destruction of our city. Now, our city probably means Jerusalem. The question is whether or not we're thinking about the destruction that happened in 586, or more likely the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple in Jerusalem that happened in 70 CE following the Jewish war with Rome. And so it's more likely the case, and most scholars agree, that this is all written in the name of another, and that the destruction of the temple in 586 is really just a cipher or a symbol for the desolation and the destruction of the temple in 70 CE. So after the war that lasted from 66 to 70 CE. The book itself, 4th Ezra, is also probably a composite text. Scholars suggest that it has a Christian frame, so a beginning and an ending that are written from a more explicitly Christian orientation. And then the middle, chapters 3 through 14, is the more or less original Jewish apocalypse. And so we're going to focus on the Jewish elements, chapters 3 through 14, but it's important to know that chapters 1 through 2 are this usually regarded as this Christian opening, and then chapters 15 through 16 are regarded as this Christian close that sort of provide a framework or a sandwich, the bread of a sandwich around the apocalypse. Scholars debate whether or not 4th Ezra was originally written in Greek, or if it was perhaps written originally in Aramaic, but then quickly translated into Greek. But we do know that it is preserved for us in a number of translations. So we have textual evidence of the Syriac tradition, of the Ethiopic tradition, the Armenian tradition, as well as two distinct Arabic translations. So that alone should suggest to us how important it was in the early church that it was so quickly translated, along with other New Testament and Old Testament writings. It's likely that it was written sometime around 100 CE, so within 3 or 4 generations of the destruction of the temple, looking backwards on that reality. And it consists of 7 visions that are of varying length in terms of how many chapters they consist of, and contain a number of different themes or elements of focus. What's interesting or important to recognize is that Ezra will have these visions or these dreams, and then he will request from God or from an angel an interpretation, and then he's given an interpretation. And so they're these symbolic visions, but they're often met with the interpretation. Now, the interpretations themselves are not necessarily clear, right? They also are using veiled or symbolic language to make sense of these visions. And I think we'll have lots of fun sort of wrestling with and unpacking these visions. Similar to our engagement with First Enoch, I'm suggesting a few parts of 4th Ezra for us to explore together. Now, like I said with First Enoch, I would encourage you to continue reading as long as it's still interesting. As soon as you feel bogged down or overwhelmed, it's fine to move on to the next section. Or you can only read those sections that are particularly interesting to you based on my very brief summation of what you'll find in each of these sections. So the first section I want you to focus on is from 3:1 through 6:34. These are the first 2 visions in 4th Ezra, and they recount Israel's history, and they provide a lot of opportunities for Ezra to voice his feelings, some of his pathos, some of his emotions, and some of his questions, especially about why righteous people seem to be getting the bad end of the deal, and how does that impact or relate to God's justice. The second part that I want you to focus on is 6:35 through 9:25. This is the third vision, and I think it's the longest vision in all of 4th Ezra. But it's worth doing the work. It's worth sitting with because it gives us a lot of insight into apocalyptic literature, into sort of portraits of the end times and eschatology, which is the formal word for the study of the end. And so it's sort of worth laboring with that third vision. The next part that I want you to focus on is 9:26 through 10:59. This is the 4th vision, and what's really interesting is we have Jerusalem depicted as a woman. Now, the Old Testament is full of examples of cities being personified as a woman, and that's true of Jerusalem, but it's also true of what Paul says in Galatians about Jerusalem. It's also true of how Jerusalem is portrayed in the book of Revelation. And so it's an interesting and important parallel to what we'll see in Revelation. And then the last part that I'd like you to focus on is 11:1 through 13:58. These are the fifth and sixth visions in fourth Ezra, and these are more explicitly political in nature. They're focusing on the rise and fall of various kingdoms. And it's really interesting that in that context, each also discusses the Messiah or provides access to certain expectations about the Messiah. And clearly, that will be an interesting part of Fourth Ezra for us to consider over against what we see in the New Testament. Now, as you read, there are any number of things that we could focus on, but I really am going to encourage you and direct you to focus on 4 questions. First, how do the visions portray God and God's activity? What is God like, according to 4th Ezra, in other words? Second, how do these visions portray humanity? Here I'm thinking especially of humanity's agency or free will, or their ability to live righteously. What does the text say about that? A third question is, what do these visions tell us about the end of the age, or about expectations around the end of the age? What is it going to be like? How are we going to know that we're in the end of the age, according to 4th Ezra? And finally, what do we learn about 4th Ezra's expectations about a Jewish Messiah, about a Jewish ruler and arbiter of justice, as we see in 4th Ezra. Friends, we are again in the deep end of the pool, swimming in some unfamiliar waters. But I hope as you engage 4th Ezra with your questions, with your insight and your observations, that we will have a robust and full conversation about 4th Ezra and what it teaches us about apocalyptic literature. But for now, happy reading.